The dust devil spun across the Texas plains like a ghost, seeking vengeance. And maybe it was. Catherine Whitmore pressed her face against the stagecoach window, watching the endless expanse of sun-baked earth stretch toward a horizon that promised nothing but more of the same. Her gloved fingers traced the faded bruise on her jaw, hidden beneath carefully applied powder and the shadow of her bonnet. Boston felt like another lifetime now. 3 months ago, she'd been Mrs. Catherine Hartwell, wife to a respected banker, with a reputation as golden as his watch chain. Behind closed doors, that same golden man had fists that moved faster than his sweet words in public. The last beating had left her unconscious for 2 days. When she'd awakened, something inside her had finally broken, or maybe it had finally healed enough to fight back. The newspaper advertisement had been her salvation, tucked between notices for patent medicines and cattle auctions. Rancher seeks bride, must be of good moral character and willing to work hard. Texas territory. No questions asked about past. That last line had sealed her fate. She'd crafted a new identity as carefully as she'd once embroidered samplers. Catherine Whitmore, orphaned schoolteacher from a small New England town that existed only in her imagination. 26 years old, never married, skilled in domestic arts. The lies flowed like honey from her pen. James Callahan owned 3,000 acres of the most unforgiving land God ever created, and he loved every rocky, stubborn inch of it. The Broken Arrow Ranch had been in his family for 2 generations, carved out of hostile territory by his grandfather's blood and his father's sweat. Now it was his turn to leave a mark on this place, but a man couldn't build a legacy alone. The accident had happened 6 months ago. 1 minute he'd been breaking a wild Mustang, the next he was flat on his back with the world gone dark. The doctor in San Antonio had used fancy words like traumatic injury and optic nerve damage, but it all boiled down to the same bitter truth. James Callahan, who could spot a rattlesnake at 50 yards and read weather patterns in cloud formations, couldn't see his own hand in front of his face. Pride was a dangerous thing in cattle country, and a blind rancher was a dead rancher. So he'd kept his secret, learning to navigate his world through memory and sound, touch and instinct. His foreman, Diego Santos, had been with the ranch for 15 years and could read James's moods better than most men read books. Diego helped maintain the illusion, speaking for James in town, handling the business that required sharp eyes and sharper judgment. But a man needed more than a loyal foreman. He needed a wife, children, a future that stretched beyond his own broken body. The newspaper advertisement had been Diego's idea, though James had written every word himself, his fingers tracing the familiar patterns of letters across paper he couldn't see. Their correspondence had begun with cautious politeness and bloomed into something that surprised them both. Catherine wrote of her love for literature, her dreams of seeing the frontier, her gentle nature that had been shaped by loss and hardship. James responded with stories of the land, descriptions of sunsets painted in words more vivid than any picture, tales of cattle drives and roundups that made her heart race with excitement. Neither mentioned the shadows that followed them. The stagecoach lurched to a halt outside Dry Creek's only hotel, and Catherine's stomach clenched with nerves that had nothing to do with the rough journey. Through the dusty window, she could see a man leaning against a hitching post, his hat pulled low over his face, tall and lean, with shoulders that spoke of hard work and harder choices. This had to be James Callahan, her intended husband. She gathered her courage with her skirts, stepping down onto the boardwalk with as much dignity as she could manage. Her traveling dress was practical rather than fashionable, dark blue wool that hid the dust of 3 days' journey. She'd chosen it specifically for this meeting, respectable but not wealthy, attractive but not ostentatious. The man straightened as she approached, and she caught her breath at her first clear look at his face. James Callahan was younger than she'd expected, maybe 32 or 33, with dark hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that suggested both strength and stubbornness. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale blue and distant, but they seemed to look right through her, rather than at her. She cleared her throat delicately. "Mr. Callahan?" His head turned toward her voice with an odd precision, as if he were tracking sound rather than sight. "Miss Whitmore, welcome to Texas." His voice was deeper than she'd imagined, roughened by wind and dust and years of shouting orders across open range. "Thank you. The journey was educational." A smile ghosted across his lips. "That's one word for it. You look tired. We should get you settled at the hotel before we head out to the ranch." Something in his manner struck her as strange. He gestured toward the hotel entrance without quite looking at it, his movements careful and measured. When she stepped forward, he fell into step beside her with the kind of spatial awareness that seemed almost supernatural. The hotel lobby was a study in frontier pragmatism, clean but sparse, with furniture built to last rather than impress. The desk clerk, a weathered man with suspicious eyes, looked Catherine up and down with the kind of evaluation she'd grown accustomed to in her weeks of travel. "Room for the lady," James said, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "She'll be staying the night before we head out to the Broken Arrow." "Sure thing, Mr. Callahan. Ma'am." The clerk's tone grew respectful as he handed over a brass key. "Room 12, top of the stairs and to the right." Catherine accepted the key with steady fingers, though her heart was racing. Tomorrow, she would become Mrs. James Callahan, wife to a man she'd never seen until today, mistress of a ranch that existed only in letters and her own imagination. The weight of her deception pressed down on her like the Texas heat. "I'll pick you up at dawn," James said, his pale eyes focused somewhere past her left shoulder. "It's a hard ride to the ranch, but we should make it by midday. I'll be ready." She hesitated, then added, "Mr. Callahan, are you feeling well? You seem tired," he finished quickly. "It's been a long day. Get some rest, Miss Whitmore. Tomorrow changes everything." He touched the brim of his hat and turned away, moving through the lobby with that same careful precision. Catherine watched him go, noting how he counted steps, how his hand brushed against the doorframe as he passed through it. A suspicion began to form in her mind, but she pushed it away. She had enough secrets of her own without borrowing trouble. Her room was small but clean, with a window that looked out over Dry Creek's main street. She could see James mounting a horse outside the hotel, his movements fluid despite that odd carefulness she'd noticed. A younger Mexican man sat on another horse nearby, waiting patiently. This must be the foreman James had mentioned in his letters, the one who'd helped build the Broken Arrow into something worth inheriting. Catherine unpacked her few belongings with methodical care. Her wedding dress, a simple affair in cream-colored silk that had cost her nearly everything she'd managed to hide from Harold's prying eyes. A small wooden box containing her mother's jewelry, the only things of value she'd managed to take when she fled Boston. A leather portfolio holding the letters James had written her, each one read and reread until she could recite them from memory. She pulled out the most recent letter, dated just 2 weeks ago. His handwriting was bold and confident, the words flowing across the page with an ease that spoke of education and practice. But now, looking at it with fresh eyes, she noticed things she'd missed before. The lines were perfectly straight, as if he'd used a ruler to guide his pen. The spacing was mathematically precise, each word occupying exactly the same amount of space as the last. It was the handwriting of a man who couldn't see what he was writing. The realization hit her like a physical blow. James Callahan was blind. That explained the careful movements, the way he'd seemed to listen to her location rather than look at her, the odd precision of his gestures. He was as much a fraud as she was, hiding his disability the way she hid her past. Catherine sank onto the narrow bed, suddenly exhausted. Here she'd been worried about her own deceptions, and her intended husband was living a lie just as elaborate as hers. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so tragic. Two broken people, each hiding their damage behind carefully constructed facades, coming together in a marriage built on mutual deception. But perhaps that made them perfect for each other. Dawn came too soon, painted in shades of orange and pink that took Catherine's breath away. She'd grown up surrounded by Boston's brick and mortar, where sunrise was something that happened between buildings rather than across endless sky. This was different, wild and vast and beautiful in a way that made her chest tight with unexpected emotion. James was waiting outside the hotel with 3 horses, his own mount, and a gentle mare that looked suited for a lady's riding. The 3rd horse was loaded with supplies, everything they'd need for the journey to the Broken Arrow. Diego Santos stood beside the supply horse, checking the ropes with professional efficiency. "Miss Whitmore," James said, touching his hat brim in greeting, "I'd like you to meet Diego Santos, my foreman. He's been with the ranch since before I inherited it." Diego was a man in his 40s, with graying hair and eyes that missed nothing. He smiled at Catherine with genuine warmth, but she caught the way he watched James, the subtle positioning that spoke of protection and loyalty. "Señora," Diego said, his accent adding music to the simple greeting. "Welcome to Texas. I hope you will be happy at the ranch." "Thank you, Mr. Santos. I'm looking forward to seeing it." James moved to her horse's side, his hands finding the stirrup and bridle with practiced ease. "This is Luna. She's gentle but sure-footed, perfect for someone still learning the country." Catherine accepted his help mounting, though she noticed he guided her more by sound and touch than sight. His hands were strong and calloused, the hands of a man who worked for a living. When he helped adjust her stirrups, she caught a whiff of leather and soap, sun-warmed cotton, and something uniquely masculine. The ride to the Broken Arrow took them through country that seemed designed to test human endurance. Rolling hills covered in short grass and scrub brush, cut through with dry creek beds and dotted with stunted mesquite trees. The sun beat down with relentless intensity, and Catherine was grateful for the wide brim of her riding hat. James rode ahead, his posture easy in the saddle despite his blindness. He seemed to navigate by some internal compass, never hesitating at forks in the trail or uncertain about direction. Diego stayed close, but not obviously so, ready to offer guidance without undermining his boss's authority. They stopped to rest the horses at midday, sharing water and jerky in the shade of a lone cottonwood. Catherine had removed her gloves to eat, and she saw James's head turn at the soft sound of her movements. His face was peaceful, almost meditative, as he listened to the sounds of the prairie around them. "It's beautiful here," she said softly. "Different from what I'm used to, but beautiful." "What's it look like to you?" James asked, his voice careful. "I mean, coming from New England, this must seem pretty foreign." Catherine considered her words. "It's like the world has been stripped down to its essentials. Sky and earth, wind and sun, nothing unnecessary, nothing false. Just what is." James smiled, the first truly relaxed expression she'd seen from him. "That's exactly what it is. This country doesn't forgive lies or weakness. It demands honesty, even when honesty hurts." The irony of his words wasn't lost on either of them, though neither acknowledged it. The Broken Arrow ranch house appeared like a mirage in the late afternoon heat, wavering and distant, until suddenly it was real and solid and welcoming. It was larger than Catherine had expected, a two-story structure built from local stone and timber, with a wide porch that wrapped around three sides. Corrals and outbuildings spread around it like satellites, and in the distance she could see cattle dotting the range. "Home," James said simply, and Catherine heard pride and love and longing in that single word. Diego rode ahead to handle their horses, leaving Catherine and James alone on the porch. She could hear sounds of life around them, chickens clucking, a dog barking somewhere, the distant lowing of cattle. This was a working ranch, not just a house, but a way of life. "The ceremony is set for tomorrow morning," James said. "Father Miguel is riding out from San Antonio. Diego's wife, Maria, has been preparing for days. She's excited to have another woman on the ranch." Catherine nodded, then remembered he couldn't see the gesture. "That sounds perfect. I'm grateful for their kindness." James turned toward her, and for a moment she had the unsettling feeling that he could see her after all. "Catherine," he said, using her first name for the first time, "I want you to know that I'll do my best to be a good husband to you. I know this isn't a conventional courtship, but I believe we can build something real together." "I hope so," she whispered. "I truly do." That evening, Catherine was introduced to Maria Santos, Diego's wife, a comfortable woman with laughing eyes and hands that never stopped moving. Maria had prepared a feast in honor of Catherine's arrival. Beef and beans, fresh bread, vegetables from her garden. The meal was served in the ranch house's dining room, a warm space lit by oil lamps and decorated with Maria's handiwork. "Senor James, he is a good man," Maria confided to Catherine as they cleared the dishes together. "Since the accident, he thinks no one sees how he struggles, but we see. We help, but we must be careful of his pride." So Maria knew about James's blindness. Catherine wondered who else was part of the conspiracy to maintain his secret. The accident was serious. Si, very serious. A horse, very wild, very angry. Senor James, he was trying to break it, and it fought back. "The doctor," he said. Maria crossed herself. "But Senor James, he will not give up. He learns to do everything different, but still the same, still strong, still proud. Catherine felt a stab of admiration for the man she was about to marry. Whatever his faults, cowardice wasn't among them. That night, alone in the guest room that would be hers for only one more night, Catherine sat before the mirror and tried to see herself clearly. Tomorrow, she would become Mrs. James Callahan, and with that name would come expectations, responsibilities, a future she'd never imagined. But she would also be taking those things under false pretenses, built on a foundation of lies that grew more elaborate each day. She thought about Harold, probably still searching for her in Boston's wealthy neighborhoods, never imagining his wife had fled to the wilds of Texas. She thought about the bank account she'd emptied, the jewelry she'd sold, the life she'd abandoned without a backward glance. That woman, that Catherine Hartwell, was dead. Tomorrow would mark the birth of someone entirely new. But what if James discovered the truth? What if her past caught up with her? Harold Hartwell wasn't the kind of man who accepted defeat gracefully. He had money, connections, private investigators who specialized in finding runaway wives. Sooner or later, he would think to look beyond New England's borders. Catherine pulled out a sheet of writing paper and began a letter to her sister in Philadelphia, the only person who knew where she'd gone. She wrote carefully, her words chosen to reveal nothing that might compromise her safety. Dear Margaret, I arrived safely and will be married tomorrow. James seems to be a good man, and I believe I can be happy here. Please don't worry about me. I'm exactly where I need to be. It was all true in its way. The morning of her wedding dawned clear and bright, with a breeze that carried the scent of sage and wildflowers. Catherine dressed carefully in her cream silk gown, her mother's pearl necklace, her something old, a blue ribbon from Maria, her something borrowed. Her reflection in the mirror looked calm, composed, ready for whatever came next. But her hand shook as she pinned her hair. Father Miguel arrived just after sunrise, an elderly priest with kind eyes and a donkey loaded with the tools of his trade. He spoke with James and Diego in rapid Spanish, their voices carrying across the yard as Catherine watched from her bedroom window. The ceremony was to be held in the ranch house parlor, witnessed by Diego and Maria and the handful of ranch hands who formed the Broken Arrow's extended family. Catherine had never imagined such a wedding. Simple, practical, stripped of the elaborate trappings she'd grown accustomed to in Boston society. But as she walked down the stairs to meet her fate, she realized this was exactly what she wanted. No crowds of people she barely knew, no elaborate display of wealth and status. Just two people making promises to each other, witnessed by those who truly mattered. James stood before the fireplace, wearing a dark suit that emphasized his lean frame and the breadth of his shoulders. His hair was neatly combed, and he'd shaved carefully, leaving his jaw smooth and clean. He looked handsome, respectable, like exactly the kind of man a woman could trust with her future. If only he knew how little she deserved that trust. Father Miguel conducted the ceremony in both English and Spanish, his voice carrying the weight of authority and tradition. Catherine spoke her vows in a clear voice, promising to love, honor, and cherish this man she barely knew, to stand by him in sickness and health, for richer or poorer. The irony was almost overwhelming. James's voice was steady as he made his own promises, his pale eyes fixed on some point just past her shoulder. His hands were warm and sure as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, and Catherine realized with a start that it fit perfectly. He'd somehow managed to guess her size, another small mystery in an already complicated situation. "You may kiss your bride," Father Miguel said, smiling benevolently. James cupped Catherine's face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones as he leaned down to kiss her. His lips were warm and gentle, the kiss chaste but full of promise. Catherine closed her eyes and let herself believe, just for a moment, that this was real, that she deserved this chance at happiness. When they broke apart, the small gathering erupted in congratulations. Maria wept openly, Diego clapped James on the shoulder, and even the ranch hands grinned and offered awkward compliments. Catherine found herself swept into a celebration that felt genuine and warm, surrounded by people who barely knew her, but welcomed her anyway. The wedding feast lasted well into the afternoon, with music and dancing and stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. Catherine learned that James played guitar, his fingers finding the strings with the same precision he brought to everything else. Diego sang in a rich baritone that made the women sigh, while Maria bustled around making sure everyone had enough to eat. But eventually the celebration wound down, and Catherine found herself alone with her new husband, facing the reality of their first night as a married couple. James had been unfailingly courteous throughout the day, but she sensed a tension in him, a nervousness that matched her own. "Your room is ready," he said as they stood together on the front porch, watching the last of the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "Maria moved your things while we were celebrating. I hope you'll be comfortable." Catherine felt a flush of relief, followed immediately by disappointment. Of course, he wouldn't expect to share a bed with her immediately. They were still strangers, despite the vows they'd exchanged. "That's very considerate of you," she said. "I know this arrangement is unusual for both of us. Perhaps we should take things slowly." James nodded, his face unreadable in the gathering darkness. "I want you to feel safe here, Catherine. This is your home now, but I don't want you to feel trapped." The word hit her like a physical blow. Trapped was exactly what she'd been in Boston, trapped by convention and fear and Harold's increasingly violent temper. But this felt different. This felt like a choice, even if it was a choice built on deception. "I don't feel trapped," she said softly. "I feel hopeful." James smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. "Good. That's good." Their first weeks together passed in a careful dance of domestic routine and growing familiarity. Catherine threw herself into learning the rhythms of ranch life, working alongside Maria to manage the household while James and Diego handled the cattle and horses. She discovered she had a talent for organization and planning, skills that translated surprisingly well from managing a Boston townhouse to running a Texas ranch. She also began to understand the elaborate system of signals and accommodations that allowed James to function as if his blindness were a minor inconvenience rather than a profound disability. Diego served as his eyes during business meetings, describing situations in a code of subtle gestures and carefully chosen words. Maria arranged the house to maximize James's ability to navigate independently, keeping furniture in exact positions and maintaining clear pathways. Even the ranch hands were part of the conspiracy, reporting to James in ways that gave him the information he needed without acknowledging his limitations. It was an impressive display of loyalty and ingenuity, and Catherine found herself admiring her husband more each day. But she also lived in constant fear of discovery. Every unfamiliar rider approaching the ranch sent her pulse racing. Every letter that arrived made her hands shake. Harold was out there somewhere, and she knew he hadn't given up searching for her. 3 weeks after their wedding, her fears materialized in the form of a well-dressed man riding an expensive horse up to the ranch house. Catherine was hanging laundry when she saw him approach, and something about his bearing, confident, predatory, used to getting what he wanted, made her blood run cold. She dropped the wet sheet she'd been pinning to the line and hurried toward the house, praying she could reach James before the stranger revealed too much. But she was too late. The man had already dismounted and was speaking with Diego in the yard, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I'm looking for a woman," he said, his Boston accent unmistakable. Catherine Hartwell. She would have traveled west about a month ago, possibly under an assumed name. I have reason to believe she came to Texas. Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself against the side of the house, hidden from view, but close enough to hear every word. This wasn't Harold himself, but it was clearly someone working for him. A private investigator, probably, the kind of man who specialized in tracking down runaway wives. "I don't know anyone by that name," Diego replied, his voice carefully neutral. "You might try asking in town. Dry Creek gets a lot of travelers. She's a beautiful woman, early 20s, well-educated, dark hair, green eyes. She would have had money, enough to travel comfortably. Ring a bell?" Catherine closed her eyes, knowing her description was accurate enough to be damning. But Diego's voice remained steady as he repeated, "I'm sorry, senor. No one like that has passed through here." "What about your boss? James Callahan, isn't it? Perhaps he's seen her." "Senor Callahan is not available at the moment," Diego said firmly, "but I handle most of the business with travelers and such. If this woman had been here, I would know." Catherine heard the sound of paper rustling, probably a photograph being produced. Her wedding portrait from Boston, most likely, the one that had appeared in all the society papers when she'd married Harold. "Take a good look," the investigator pressed. "She's wanted in connection with a theft. A substantial amount of money went missing when she disappeared." The lie was so smooth, so plausible, that Catherine almost believed it herself. Of course Harold would claim she'd stolen from him. It gave him legal grounds to pursue her, made her a criminal rather than a victim. The money she'd taken had been her own inheritance, held in trust by her husband according to the laws of Massachusetts. But proving that would require lawyers, courts, publicity, all things that would destroy the new life she'd built. "I'm sorry," Diego repeated. "I've never seen this woman." The investigator spent another 10 minutes pressing for information, describing Catherine's appearance in detail, offering a reward for information leading to her capture. But Diego remained unmoved, his loyalty to the ranch and its inhabitants absolute. Finally, the man remounted his horse and rode away, but not before leaving his card with Diego and a promise to return if any new information came to light. Catherine waited until the dust cloud from his departure had settled before emerging from her hiding place, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. Diego found her there, slumped against the house with tears streaming down her face. He took one look at her expression and understood everything. "Senora Catherine," he said gently, "we need to talk." They sat in the kitchen, while Maria clucked over Catherine like a worried hen, pressing hot coffee into her hands and muttering prayers in Spanish. Diego's weathered face was kind but serious as he studied the woman he'd helped welcome into their family. "The man, he was looking for you," Diego said. "It wasn't a question." Catherine nodded, unable to trust her voice. "And the money he mentioned? It was mine," Catherine whispered. "My inheritance. But my husband controlled it, and when I left—" She took a shaky breath. "He'll claim I stole it. He'll claim whatever he has to claim to get me back." Diego exchanged a look with his wife, some wordless communication passing between them. Finally, he leaned forward and covered Catherine's hands with his own. "Señora, we have all done things we are not proud of. We have all run from something. This is the frontier. It is where people come to start over, to become new. Your husband, he does not need to know about this man's visit. But he'll be back," Catherine said. "Harold won't give up. He'll send more investigators, offer bigger rewards. Eventually someone will talk." "Maybe," Diego conceded, "but maybe not. This is big country and people here mind their own business. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "Senor James has his own secrets to protect. Perhaps it is better that you both understand what it means to need hiding." Catherine stared at him, realizing that Diego knew she'd figured out James's blindness. The conspiracy of silence worked both ways, protecting both husband and wife from truths they weren't ready to face. That evening, Catherine watched her husband more carefully than ever before. James moved through their routine with practiced ease, checking on the horses, reviewing the day's work with Diego, planning for tomorrow's activities. To any casual observer, he appeared to be a competent rancher, managing his property with skill and intelligence. But Catherine saw the small accommodations now, the way he relied on sound and touch and memory to navigate his world. She saw how Diego positioned himself to be James's eyes, how Maria arranged things to maximize his independence, how the ranch hands accepted his authority without question despite his disability. It was an elaborate performance, but also something more. It was love in action, the kind of loyalty and devotion that money couldn't buy. Harold had commanded obedience through fear and financial dependence. James had earned devotion through fairness and respect. The contrast couldn't have been starker. "You're quiet tonight," James observed as they sat together on the front porch, listening to the night sounds of the prairie. "Are you feeling well?" "Just thinking," Catherine replied, "about how different everything is here, how honest." James was silent for a long moment. "Honest can be a relative thing," he said finally. "Sometimes people have reasons for not sharing everything about themselves immediately." Catherine's heart skipped a beat. Was he talking about his blindness, or did he somehow know about her past? "I suppose everyone has secrets," she said carefully. "Things they're not proud of, things they wish they could change. The question is whether those secrets define who we are, or whether they're just baggage we carry until we're strong enough to set it down." Catherine turned to study his profile in the moonlight. James was staring straight ahead, his face peaceful but thoughtful. She wondered what he saw in his darkness, whether he visualized the landscape from memory or had learned to find beauty in other senses. "What if the baggage is too heavy?" she asked. "What if setting it down means hurting people we care about?" James was quiet for so long that Catherine thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, His voice was soft, almost uncertain. "I think," he said, "that the people who truly care about us want us to be free of whatever burdens we carry. Even if the truth is painful, it's better than living a lie." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. Here was a man who understood the weight of deception, who lived with his own elaborate fiction every day. If anyone could understand her situation, it would be James. But telling him the truth meant risking everything she'd built, everything she'd come to treasure. It meant potentially losing not just her husband, but her entire new life, her safety, her chance at happiness. The next morning brought news that drove all thoughts of confession from Catherine's mind. Diego returned from town with word that 3 more investigators had arrived in Dry Creek, all asking questions about a missing woman from Boston. Harold was escalating his search, casting a wider net, offering larger rewards. "They're being careful," Diego reported grimly. "Not mentioning theft or any criminal charges, just saying they're looking for a woman whose family is worried about her welfare. Makes them sound like the good guys." Catherine felt the walls of her safe world closing in. It was only a matter of time before someone connected her description to the new Mrs. Callahan. Her marriage to James was a matter of public record, witnessed by Father Miguel and registered in the county courthouse. If the investigators thought to check marriage records, "We could leave," James said quietly when Diego had finished his report. They were sitting in his study, the room that served as the ranch's business center. Catherine had never been inside before, and she was struck by how organized everything was, how precisely arranged to accommodate a man who couldn't see. "Leave?" Catherine repeated, startled. "Head west, maybe California. Start fresh somewhere else. I've got enough savings to buy land, build a new ranch." "But this is your home," Catherine protested. "Your family's legacy. You can't give that up for me." James turned toward her, and for a moment she could have sworn his pale eyes met hers directly. "Catherine, in the short time we've been married, you've brought more life to this place than it's seen in years. Maria sings while she works now. Diego smiles more. Even the damn chickens seem happier." Despite everything, Catherine found herself smiling. "I don't think I can take credit for the chickens. The point is," James continued, "this ranch is just land and buildings without people to make it a home. You've done that. You've made it a home. If staying here puts you in danger, then we leave. Simple as that." Catherine felt her heart swell with an emotion she barely recognized. When had anyone ever offered to sacrifice something important for her safety? Harold had certainly never put her welfare above his own interests. "It's not that simple," she said. "There are things about me you don't know. Things that would make you understand why running might not solve anything." James leaned back in his chair, his expression patient and encouraging. "I'm listening." Catherine took a deep breath, knowing she was about to either save her marriage or destroy it entirely. "My name isn't Catherine Whitmore. It's Catherine Hartwell. I was married before, to a man in Boston, a wealthy, powerful man who hurt me badly. When I ran away, I took money, my own inheritance, but legally his to control. Now he's claiming I'm a thief, sending investigators to find me and drag me back." The silence that followed her confession seemed to stretch forever. James's face revealed nothing, no shock or anger or disgust. He simply sat quietly, processing what she'd told him. "How badly did he hurt you?" he asked finally, his voice carefully controlled. Catherine's hand moved instinctively to her ribs, where the memory of Harold's last beating still ached in certain weather. Badly enough that I chose to flee to a frontier I'd never seen, rather than stay with him another day. James nodded slowly. And the investigators think you're a criminal. Harold's made sure of that. It gives him legal grounds to pursue me, makes me look like the villain instead of the victim. But you're not a criminal. No, Catherine said firmly. I took what was rightfully mine and ran for my life. James was quiet again, thinking. Catherine watched his face, trying to read his emotions, but his expression remained neutral. Finally, he spoke. Catherine, and that is your real name, isn't it? She nodded, then remembered he couldn't see the gesture. Yes, Catherine Elizabeth Whitmore was my maiden name. Catherine, he repeated, as if testing how it sounded. Thank you for telling me the truth. I know it wasn't easy. Are you angry? She asked, her voice small. James smiled, the expression transforming his face. Angry? No. Impressed, maybe. It takes courage to leave everything behind and start over. It takes even more courage to trust someone with the truth. Catherine felt tears of relief slip down her cheeks. I was so afraid you'd hate me for lying. We've all got things we're not proud of, James said. The question is what we do going forward. He stood and moved to the window, his fingers finding the frame with practiced ease. For a moment he stood there silently, and Catherine wondered what he was thinking, what he was planning. Here's what we're going to do, he said finally. We're going to make it very difficult for anyone to connect Catherine Whitmore Callahan with Catherine Hartwell from Boston. Diego's going to spread the word in town that my wife is from a small farming community in New Mexico, that we corresponded through mutual friends rather than newspaper advertisements. We'll get Father Miguel to adjust his records accordingly. You do that? Risk trouble with the law? James turned back toward her, and again she had that uncanny feeling that he could see her perfectly. Catherine, I've been living a lie for months. Every day I pretend I can see what I can't, that I'm the same man I was before the accident. If we're going to build something real together, maybe it's time we both stopped pretending. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. James, I'm blind, he said simply, the words falling between them like stones into still water. Have been for 6 months now. Got thrown by a Mustang and hit my head on a rock. Doctor said the damage was permanent. The confession hung in the air, years of careful deception dissolved in a handful of words. Catherine stared at her husband, seeing him clearly for the first time. Not the competent rancher who seemed to navigate the world with supernatural ease, but a man who'd lost everything that defined him and had spent months learning to be someone new. I know, she whispered. James's head snapped toward her, surprise flickering across his features. You know? I suspected from the first day. The way you moved, how you listened instead of looking, your handwriting. It's too perfect, too precise, like someone who has to count spaces because they can't see the page. And you married me anyway. It wasn't a question, but there was wonder in his voice. And you married me knowing I was hiding something too. They looked at each other across the study. Two people who'd built their relationship on mutual deception finally seeing each other without masks. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of truth finally spoken, of burdens finally shared. So where does that leave us? Catherine asked. James smiled, And this time, the expression was completely genuine, free of the careful control he usually maintained. Married to someone who understands what it's like to reinvent yourself out of necessity could be worse. Despite everything, the investigators closing in, the uncertain future, the weight of their mutual secrets, Catherine found herself laughing. Could be better, too. Could be, James agreed. But it's honest. Finally, the next few days passed in a strange state of suspended animation. The investigators continued their search, interviewing locals and showing Catherine's photograph. But Diego's network of loyal friends and neighbors held firm. No one remembered seeing a woman matching her description. No one recalled any newcomers except for the school teacher who'd married James Callahan, and she was from New Mexico. Everyone knew that. Meanwhile, Catherine and James began the delicate process of rebuilding their relationship on a foundation of truth instead of lies. It was awkward at first. Years of careful pretense couldn't be undone overnight. But slowly, tentatively, they began to share the real stories of their lives. James told her about the accident, about the terrifying months of learning to navigate a world gone dark. He described the depression that had nearly consumed him, the rage at his helplessness, the slow, painful process of accepting his new reality. "The worst part wasn't losing my sight," he confided one evening as they sat together on the porch. "It was losing my sense of who I was. I'd always been James Callahan, the rancher who could spot trouble from a mile away, who never met a horse he couldn't break or a problem he couldn't solve. Suddenly, I was just helpless." Catherine understood that feeling intimately. "I felt the same way when I realized I had to leave Boston. I'd been Catherine Hartwell, the perfect banker's wife, for so long that I didn't know who Catherine Whitmore was anymore. I had to invent her from scratch." "And now you're Catherine Callahan," James observed. "Third time's the charm?" "Hope so," she said softly. "I really hope so." Their conversations revealed layers of compatibility they'd never imagined during their careful courtship by letter. James had a dry sense of humor that matched her own. Catherine had a practical intelligence that complemented his intuitive understanding of the land and its rhythms. They both loved books, though James hadn't been able to read since the accident. Catherine began reading aloud to him in the evenings, her voice bringing stories to life in their cozy parlor. They also began to work together more closely, Catherine serving as James's eyes during ranch business, while learning to see the land through his other senses. She discovered that he could identify individual cattle by the sound of their movement, predict weather changes from the feel of the wind, locate lost horses by following trails invisible to sighted eyes. "You're better at this than most men who can see," she told him one afternoon as they rode out to check on a herd in the north pasture. "Different skills," James replied. "I had to learn to pay attention to things I used to ignore. Turns out there's a lot of information in the world if you know how to listen for it." Catherine was learning to listen too, not just to the sounds of the prairie, but to the subtle cues in James's voice that told her when he needed help and when his pride required her to step back. It was a delicate balance, but one that grew easier with each passing day. Their physical relationship remained cautious, both of them scarred by their past experiences in different ways. But there were moments, a hand lingering longer than necessary, a kiss that lasted beyond mere politeness, a shared glance across the dinner table that hinted at deeper possibilities. The crisis came, as Catherine had always known it would, on a Tuesday morning in late summer. She was in the garden with Maria, harvesting tomatoes for canning, when Diego rode up to the house at a pace that immediately set her nerves on edge. His face was grim as he dismounted, and Catherine knew before he spoke that her time had run out. "There are men at the gate," he said without preamble. "4 of them, well armed, with a warrant." Catherine's hands went numb, and the tomato she'd been holding dropped to the ground with a soft thud. "A warrant for what?" "Theft. They're claiming you stole money and jewelry from your husband in Boston. They have legal authority to arrest you and take you back for trial." The world seemed to spin around Catherine. She'd known this moment would come, but she'd allowed herself to hope, to believe that maybe she could outrun her past forever. Now reality was crashing down with brutal efficiency. "Where's James?" she managed to ask. "In the north pasture with the crew. I sent Miguel to get him, but—" "There's no time," Catherine finished. She could see the dust cloud approaching the house, still distant, but coming fast. 4 men with legal papers and probably weapons, determined to drag her back to Boston and Harold's tender mercies. "Senora," Diego said urgently, "there's a back trail through the canyon. You could reach the Hendersons' place, hide there until—" "No." Catherine's voice was surprisingly steady. "I'm tired of running." She walked into the house and up to the bedroom she shared with James, moving with deliberate calm. From the wardrobe, she pulled out her small valise and began packing essentials: a change of clothes, her mother's jewelry, the letters James had written during their courtship. Her hands were steady as she worked, though her heart hammered against her ribs. By the time she heard horses in the yard, she was ready. The men who came to the door looked exactly as she'd expected: professional, determined, armed with both legal authority and actual weapons. Their leader was a tall man with cold eyes and a badge that proclaimed him a federal marshal. He spoke to Diego in clipped, official tones. "We're looking for Catherine Hartwell, wanted on charges of theft in Boston, Massachusetts. We have reliable information that she's here under the name Catherine Callahan." "I am Catherine Callahan," Catherine said, stepping onto the porch before Diego could respond. "And yes, I used to be Catherine Hartwell." The marshal's eyes sharpened as he studied her face, comparing it to the photograph he undoubtedly carried. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for the theft of money and jewelry belonging to Harold Hartwell. You have the right to—" "I know my rights," Catherine interrupted. "The money was my inheritance, held in trust by my husband according to Massachusetts law. The jewelry belonged to my mother. I took nothing that wasn't rightfully mine." "That's for a judge to decide," the marshal said, not unkindly. "You'll have your chance to present your case in court." Catherine nodded, knowing that Harold's money and influence would make any legal defense nearly impossible. Rich men didn't lose cases against runaway wives, especially when those wives had fled to the frontier and married strangers. "I need a moment to say goodbye to my husband," she said. The marshal hesitated, then nodded. "Make it quick." Catherine turned to find James standing in the doorway behind her, his face pale but determined. He must have ridden hard to get here so quickly, and she could see the strain of the wild ride in his posture. "Catherine," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm sorry," she whispered, moving close enough to speak without the marshal's overhearing. "I'm so sorry I brought this to your door." "Don't," James said fiercely. "Don't you dare apologize for surviving. Take care of yourself." she continued as if he hadn't spoken. Don't let pride make you reject help when you need it. The ranch needs you, but it needs you alive and whole. Catherine, listen to me. James gripped her shoulders, his fingers digging into her flesh. This isn't over. I'm coming to Boston. I'll hire the best lawyers money can buy. I'll testify on your behalf. No, Catherine said firmly. You'll stay here where you belong. You'll take care of the ranch and the people who depend on you. You'll find someone who can give you the life you deserve, someone without my complications. Like hell I will. The vehemence in his voice surprised her. James had always been gentle with her, careful and considerate. She'd never seen him truly angry before. You're my wife, he continued, his voice low but carrying clearly. My partner, my equal. I don't abandon my partners when things get difficult. James. Ma'am, the marshal interrupted, we need to go. Catherine nodded, blinking back tears she refused to shed in front of these men. She kissed James once, quickly, tasting desperation and determination in equal measure. I love you, she whispered against his lips. Whatever happens, remember that. Before he could respond, she stepped back and walked toward the waiting horses, her spine straight and her head held high. She might be going back to Boston as a prisoner, but she wouldn't go as a coward. The journey back east was a nightmare of dusty trains and uncomfortable hotel rooms, always under guard, always aware that every mile took her farther from the life she'd built and closer to the man she'd fled. The marshals were professional, but not cruel, allowing her privacy for personal needs and decent meals at regular intervals. But Catherine barely tasted the food or noticed the scenery flashing past train windows. Her thoughts remained in Texas, with a blind rancher who'd offered to sacrifice everything for her safety. Boston in autumn was everything she'd forgotten. Crowded, dirty, loud with the sounds of commerce and industry. The city she'd once called home felt foreign now, as if her months on the prairie had fundamentally changed how she perceived civilization. Harold was waiting at the courthouse when they arrived, looking exactly as she remembered, handsome, well-dressed, every inch the successful businessman. But Catherine saw things she'd missed before, or maybe chosen to ignore. The calculation in his smile, the way his eyes assessed her like a piece of property, the possessive set of his shoulders as he watched her being led up the courthouse steps. "Catherine," he said, stepping forward as if to embrace her. "Thank God you're safe. I've been so worried." Catherine stepped back, putting the marshal between them. "Hello, Harold." His smile faltered slightly at her cool tone, but he recovered quickly. "You look well. Different, but well. Country life seems to have agreed with you." "It did," Catherine replied evenly. "Very much." The preliminary hearing was a formality, as Catherine had expected. Harold's lawyer painted her as a disturbed woman who'd stolen from her devoted husband and fled west to hide her crimes. Her court-appointed attorney seemed competent but overwhelmed, clearly outmatched by Harold's expensive legal team. Catherine was remanded to custody pending trial, housed in a women's facility that was clean but depressing. Her cell was small and gray, with a single window that looked out on a brick wall. At night, lying on her narrow cot, she closed her eyes and tried to remember the vast Texas sky, the sound of wind through prairie grass, the warmth of James's hand holding hers. The trial began 3 weeks later on a cold October morning that reminded Catherine why she'd fallen in love with Texas sunshine. The courtroom was packed with curious spectators drawn by the scandalous story of a banker's wife who'd abandoned civilization for the frontier. Harold's case was presented with the kind of theatrical flair that money could buy. Expert witnesses testified about Catherine's deteriorating mental state in the months before her disappearance. Bank officials confirmed that large sums of money had been withdrawn from accounts under Harold's control. Society matrons spoke sadly of her increasingly erratic behavior, her withdrawal from social obligations, her unnatural interest in topics unsuitable for ladies. It was a masterful performance, painting Catherine as a mentally unstable woman who'd stolen from her devoted husband and fled to avoid the consequences of her actions. The fact that the money had originally been her inheritance was mentioned only in passing, lost in the larger narrative of betrayal and theft. Catherine's defense was hampered by her own circumstances. Her lawyer couldn't call character witnesses from Texas without revealing her new identity and marriage, information that would only support the prosecution's claims about her deceptive nature. Medical evidence of Harold's abuse was minimal. Bruises healed, and she'd been too ashamed to seek help when it mattered. But on the third day of the trial, something unexpected happened. Catherine was called to testify on her own behalf, and as she took the witness stand, she saw a familiar figure in the back of the courtroom. James Callahan sat in the last row, wearing the same dark suit he'd worn for their wedding. His pale eyes were fixed in her direction with absolute attention, and despite everything, Catherine felt her heart lift. He'd come. Despite her protests, despite the danger to his own carefully constructed life, he'd come to Boston to fight for her. Catherine's testimony was straightforward and honest. She described her marriage to Harold, the escalating violence, her growing desperation. She explained about the money, how it had been her inheritance from her maternal grandmother, held in trust by her husband according to the property laws of Massachusetts. "I didn't steal anything," she said, looking directly at the jury. "I took what was mine by right and used it to escape a man who was slowly killing me." Harold's lawyer cross-examined her with surgical precision, picking apart inconsistencies in her story, questioning her decision to flee rather than seek legal remedy, suggesting that her allegations of abuse were fabrications designed to justify theft. But Catherine held firm, her voice never wavering as she described the reality of her marriage. When the lawyer demanded to know why she hadn't sought help from the authorities, she looked straight at Harold and said, "Because my husband was a pillar of the community, a respected businessman with friends in high places. Who would have believed me over him?" The lawyer moved on quickly, but Catherine saw several jury members exchange glances. She'd planted a seed of doubt, at least. When her testimony concluded, Catherine expected to be returned to her cell to await the jury's verdict. Instead, her lawyer approached the bench and requested permission to call a surprise witness. "Your Honor, James Callahan has traveled from Texas to provide testimony relevant to this case." Harold's lawyer objected strenuously, arguing that this witness hadn't been disclosed in discovery, that his testimony was irrelevant to the charges. But the judge, perhaps intrigued by the unusual circumstances, allowed James to take the stand. Catherine watched her husband navigate the unfamiliar courtroom with careful precision, his hand trailing along the rail as he made his way to the witness box. To most observers, It probably looked like normal caution in an unfamiliar environment. Only Catherine knew the tremendous courage it took for him to expose himself like this. James was sworn in with steady voice, giving his name and occupation. Catherine's lawyer began with basic questions: how long he'd known Catherine, the circumstances of their meeting, his observations of her character and behavior. "She's the most honest woman I've ever met," James said simply. "Hard-working, intelligent, kind to everyone on the ranch. She's made my home a better place just by being in it." "And you believe her claims about her previous marriage?" "I've seen the scars," James replied, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, "physical and otherwise. Nobody fakes that kind of pain." Harold's lawyer rose for cross-examination, clearly intending to discredit this frontier witness. "Mr. Callahan, you claim to have observed my client carefully. Tell me, what was she wearing when you first met her?" Catherine held her breath. It was a trap, designed to expose James's blindness and undermine his credibility as a witness. James smiled slightly. Dark blue traveling dress? Practical, rather than fashionable. Dust on the hem from the stagecoach journey? Brown leather gloves, though she removed them during our conversation. Small hat with a ribbon that had come loose during travel. The description was perfect, drawn from his memories of their first meeting. Catherine realized he must have asked Diego to describe her appearance in detail, preparing for exactly this kind of challenge. The lawyer pressed on, asking about other details, other observations. But James answered every question with confidence, his responses painting a picture of a man who paid careful attention to the woman he'd married. Finally frustrated, the lawyer played his ace card. "Mr. Callahan, isn't it true that you suffer from a disability that would affect your ability to observe my client accurately?" The courtroom fell silent. Catherine saw Harold lean forward with interest, scenting victory. James was quiet for a long moment, and Catherine could see him weighing his options. He could lie, maintain the fiction that had protected him for months. Or he could tell the truth and risk destroying not just his own credibility, but his entire, carefully constructed life. "Yes," he said finally, "I'm blind." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Harold's lawyer smiled triumphantly, clearly believing he'd just destroyed the defense's key witness. "So your testimony about observing my client is worthless," the lawyer pressed. "You can't actually see her at all." "No," James agreed. "I can't see her, but I can hear the honesty in her voice when she speaks. I can feel the way she moves through the world carefully, as if she's afraid of taking up too much space. I can sense the way she flinches when doors slam or voices are raised in anger." He turned toward the jury, his pale eyes somehow managing to convey absolute sincerity despite their lack of focus. "I may not be able to see Catherine Callahan," he continued, "but I know her in ways that have nothing to do with sight. I know her kindness toward the people who work for us. I know her courage in facing a life completely different from what she knew before. I know her gentleness with injured animals and her strength when difficult decisions need to be made." James paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the absolute conviction of truth. "Most of all, I know what it's like to live with shame, to hide who you really are because you're afraid the world won't accept your weakness. Mrs. Hartwell, my wife, lived with that fear for years. The only difference between us is that her shame was imposed by someone else's cruelty, while mine came from my own pride. The courtroom was absolutely silent now, everyone hanging on his words. She didn't steal anything, James concluded. She saved herself the only way she could. And then she had the courage to build a new life from nothing. That's not a criminal act. That's heroism. Harold's lawyer tried to continue his cross-examination, but the damage was done. James had transformed his disability from a weakness into a source of credibility, his blindness becoming proof of his ability to see what others missed. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with their verdict. Not guilty on all charges. Catherine felt her knees buckle with relief as the judge dismissed the case and ordered her immediate release. Harold's face was a mask of rage as his carefully constructed case collapsed, but there was nothing more he could do. In the eyes of the law, Catherine was free. But freedom and safety weren't the same thing, as Catherine discovered when Harold cornered her outside the courthouse. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You humiliated me in there, made me look like a fool. I won't forget that." "It's over, Harold," Catherine replied firmly. "We're divorced in the eyes of God and man. I'm married to someone else now, someone who knows how to treat a woman with respect." Harold's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with familiar brutality. "You're still my wife, no matter what some frontier preacher might have mumbled over you. And wives belong with their husbands." Before Catherine could respond, a strong hand settled on Harold's shoulder, spinning him around. James stood there, his face calm, but his posture radiating controlled violence. "I believe you heard my wife," James said, pleasantly. "She told you it was over." Harold looked James up and down, taking in his work-hardened appearance, the calluses on his hands, the lean strength of his frame. "You're the cowboy she ran off with? The blind man?" "That's right," James agreed. "And you're the man who thinks it's acceptable to put his hands on a woman in anger. I have to say, that doesn't sit well with me." "She belongs to me," Harold snarled, tightening his grip on Catherine's wrist. "She's my property." The blow came so fast that Catherine barely saw it. One moment, Harold was holding her wrist. The next, he was flat on his back on the courthouse steps, blood trickling from his nose. James stood over him, his fists relaxed but ready. "In Texas, we don't consider women to be property," James said conversationally. "Might want to remember that for future reference." Harold scrambled to his feet, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. "This isn't finished." "Yes, it is." The voice belonged to Catherine's lawyer, who approached with several official-looking documents. "Mr. Hartwell, these are restraining orders prohibiting you from contacting, following, or harassing my client. Violation will result in immediate arrest and prosecution. I suggest you consider this matter closed." Harold looked around the group. Catherine, James, the lawyer, several curious bystanders who'd witnessed the confrontation, and apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor. With a final venomous glare, he stalked away, disappearing into the Boston crowd. Catherine sagged against James, suddenly exhausted. "Is it really over?" "It's over," James confirmed, his arm tightening around her. "We're going home." The train journey back to Texas was everything the trip east hadn't been. Leisurely, comfortable, filled with quiet conversation and shared relief. Catherine told James about the months of fear, the sleepless nights wondering when her past would catch up with her. James described the agonizing weeks of preparing for the trial, learning Boston law, practicing his testimony until he could deliver it without hesitation. "You risked everything coming here," Catherine said as they watched the landscape change from industrial cities to farmland to open prairie. "If Harold's lawyer had discredited your testimony—" "He couldn't," James replied, "because everything I said was true. That's the advantage of honesty. You never have to remember what lie you told to whom." Catherine smiled, settling more comfortably against his shoulder. "No more lies between us?" "No more lies," James confirmed, "about anything." They arrived at the Broken Arrow on a crisp November morning, the sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Catherine had forgotten how vast everything seemed here, how the horizon stretched endlessly in all directions. After the cramped confines of courtrooms and train cars, the open space felt like a blessing. The entire ranch turned out to welcome them home. Diego and Maria, the ranch hands, even Father Miguel had ridden out from San Antonio. There was a celebration that lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and enough food to feed a small army. But eventually, the guests went home, and the hands returned to their quarters, leaving Catherine and James alone on the front porch of their house, their real house, where they belonged, where they could finally be themselves without pretense or fear. "So what happens now?" Catherine asked, leaning against the porch railing and looking out over the moonlit prairie. James moved to stand beside her, his hand finding hers with easy familiarity. "Now we build the life we should have had from the beginning, based on truth instead of lies, trust instead of fear." "It won't be easy," Catherine warned. "I'm still learning how to be honest after years of hiding who I really was." "We'll learn together," James replied. "That's what marriage is supposed to be. Two people helping each other become better than they were alone." Catherine turned to study her husband's profile in the moonlight. The strong jaw, the straight nose, the pale eyes that had learned to see the world in ways she was still discovering. He was everything Harold hadn't been, gentle when he could be, fierce when he needed to be, honest even when it cost him dearly. "I love you, James Callahan," she said softly. "All of you, exactly as you are." James turned toward her, his hands cupping her face with tender precision. "And I love you, Catherine Callahan, the real you, not the woman you thought you had to be to survive." He kissed her then deeply and thoroughly, and Catherine finally understood what it meant to be truly seen by another person, not despite her flaws and fears and painful history, but because of them, because they had made her who she was, the woman strong enough to save herself and brave enough to love again. When they finally broke apart, James rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the cool night air. "Welcome home, Mrs. Callahan," he whispered. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan," Catherine replied, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything." Above them, the Texas stars shone with brilliant intensity, and Catherine thought she could finally see clearly, not just the landscape around her, but the future stretching ahead. It wouldn't be easy, building a life on honesty after so many years of deception, but it would be real, and it would be theirs. And that was more than she had ever dared to hope for. The wind rustled through the prairie grass, carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers and the promise of rain. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly, and closer to the house, she could hear the gentle sounds of the ranch settling in for the night. This was home. Not the grand mansion in Boston with its elaborate furnishings and carefully maintained facades, but this simple stone house surrounded by endless sky. Home was where you could be yourself completely, where your worst truths were accepted along with your best intentions. Home was wherever James Callahan was, and Catherine finally understood that some kinds of wealth couldn't be measured in dollars or social position. The real treasure was finding someone who saw you clearly and loved you anyway. Someone who would travel across a continent to fight for you when you couldn't fight for yourself. As they walked into their house together, Catherine caught a glimpse of their reflection in the hallway mirror. Two people who had found each other across impossible odds, who had learned to build something beautiful from the broken pieces of their past. The mail-order bride secret was finally safe, not because it was hidden, but because it had been shared with someone who understood the weight of carrying shame alone. And in the sharing, both the secret and the shame had finally lost their power to define who she was or who she could become. Outside, the Texas night sang its ancient song of wind and space and endless possibility, and Catherine Callahan fell asleep in her husband's arms, finally free